not being callous. That's just describing what it actually is.
No, I'm just talking biology.
Yeah, like that. It's just biology. We're not trying to devalue anything. We're just saying this is what it is at this stage in the game. This is what we're talking about here. It's literally a cluster of cells.
That's it.
Period.
If I pulled a hair from my head, there's more cells there at the end of the hair than there are in this little microscopic. If you look at,
I tell people this often. We do get amazing people on the podcast who are just so knowledgeable about their fields. It's rare you get two on the same conversation. So I'm super excited because we're talking about a topic that I think is at the forefront, not of just like our cultural moment, but also for a lot of people who are renegotiating their faith. First, let me just say I'm happy to have Dr. Jennifer Bird and Dr. Michael West with me. Both of you, thank you for making time. It means the world. Why don't we just start with introductions? Jen, why don't you go first? Can I give the audience a brief introduction? You've been on the podcast before. You're no stranger to me, but we have a lot of new listeners. So go ahead and tell us who you are.
Great. Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Tim. I am a biblical scholar. My PhD is in New Testament and early Christianity. I do also have a Master of Divinity. So 3 years doing the church-related stuff and then on to PhD work after that. I think the short answer or the short introduction to who I am is I was an evangelical in my 20s. I was trying to bring people to Jesus. And so I identify with the evangelical label, fundamentalist way of reading the Bible, that kind of thing. And that's ultimately what got me to seminary and then on to PhD work, was engaging the Bible through this informed lens changed things for me. So now what I do is I help people bring critical thinking to reading the Bible. And that plays out for people in lots of different locations and religious and faith commitments. And I'm fine with that, right? Whole range, right? So
whole range.
Just a public biblical scholar at this point.
And you have a new book out, Bible and the Marriage, or not Marriage and the Bible. What do the texts say? Great.
Do, yeah.
I was looking forward to pull it up. It's somewhere on my shelf back here, but it's a great book. So I recommend it to everyone. And one of the first episodes when you were on, there it is. Thank you. I labeled the episode "Why You Don't Want a Biblical Marriage."
Indeed. Indeed.
And people seem to like it. So it's great to have you again.
Thanks, Tim.
I love it.
It's nice to be back.
Absolutely. Mike, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, so no formal theological training, but like I think many of your viewers, my background is as an evangelical. So I guess my high school year, I accepted Christ as my Savior. And for about 9 years of my life, my goal in life was really to use my skills in science. I was born with a test tube in my hand. I loved science, always did. Had a lab above my garage when I was like 9 years old doing all kinds of experiments and things. And so I began a serious study of the Bible in different directions, but I guess largely focused on the issue of evolution and creation, because I thought if there should be some, sort of fingerprints of God in the fossil record, some evidence if this huge event occurred in the past, either evolution or creation, there's got to be convincing evidence one way or another. And unfortunately, after years of study for a master's degree, actually, in paleobiology, I came to the very reluctant conclusion that evolution was a fact. It's very difficult to defend creationism if you're a serious scholar. And then exploring deeper into the Bible, I had fundamental problems with the Bible. So what does one do when one loses one's confidence in the certainty of Christianity in particular? I don't know, it was a flash of insight or something happened to me. And I realized that my goal in life should be to tackle a problem that I think Christian and secular humanists can agree upon, which is to improve human health. In particular, I decided to go after the most challenging problem in health, and one that has certain biblical implications, and that's aging and death itself. So I became a gerontologist. I decided to study the biology of aging to see, can we get rid of aging and death.
Any luck so far? Any luck?
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Look at the internet. Look at the internet. There's major advances in understanding why we age.
Oh, cool.
And so, yeah, that's been a lot of fun. What that got me involved with, and in regard to this topic of embryo ethics, is part of the puzzle I needed to solve, the puzzle piece I needed to solve, is I needed to isolate cells that don't age, human cells that don't age. And the only cells that I believed we could isolate were in the early stages of human development. When the egg is fertilized by sperm, you get this cluster of cells that is used in IVF procedures. And many of them were being thrown away, those little fertilized egg cells. And I wanted to isolate cells from them called human embryonic stem cells. And some of the viewers may remember President Bush addressing our country in 2001. His first national address was on these cells. And that was a project I initiated. And so I got very much involved in the embryo ethics debates as a result of that, and some work in cloning and so on. And it's somewhat ironic that an ex-evangelical finds themselves in opposition to the religious right, who vehemently, I think, and without proper knowledge, opposed a lot of this new science. So that's a bit of my background.
Oh, just a bit. Wow. I mean, I feel like we could have several conversations around what you just talked about. On a personal level, I'm so fascinated in death and aging. Maybe we'll have you back for a different conversation on just the science of that, because
Sure.
I would just hog all the time asking 1,000 questions about that. Yeah, that's really helpful. I appreciate you sharing that background. Maybe let's just start here. I want to have a few maybe understood agreements that I know we agree on, but I think the audience, it might benefit them to hear. The first thing is, obviously, all of us want to take this issue seriously and be as ethical as possible as we navigate it. Is that a fair statement to make, right? Because there's this narrative out there that we know that there are people who just want to kill kids in the womb and just toss them aside. And it's like, it's very extreme language, granted, but for some people, it really takes root. And when we have this conversation, the other perspective, some folks might think that we're just being callous, or that we don't care about children or humanity, right, or what's happening to a fetus as it develops. That's not what this is about. Right. Obviously, we want to be as ethical as we can be as we navigate what is going to be a very complicated and I'm sure nuanced discussion. Let me just say, I'm put my cards on the table. I am not the academic ever at any of these conversations, because I am not an academic. So my job is to ask questions that I think the audience wants to hear experts potentially answer around these topics. So we're going to handle the scientific side, and then of course the theological side. If you're cool with it, I do want to kind of start with the scientific side, because I think that's probably, frankly, where even I am most in the dark. Now, you two and someone else, I don't know his name, created a statement. Is this correct? On embryos and IVF.
Two other guys.
Sorry. Okay. Yes. Yeah. And I'll make sure I link that.
Thank you. That'd be great.
The show notes so folks can see it. It's a great statement. I found it so great. One of the things, and either of you, of course, can chime in here, but I'm assuming this is more Mike's specialty. One of the things that stood out to me was when you talk about how, essentially, I'm going to paraphrase here, that when a sperm meets an egg, there's a lot of things that happen before it could become a twin or not, something to that effect. And so when this argument that life begins at conception isn't really like the full scope of what's actually happening. Can you just give us some scientific data on what goes on, and how do we think about when does life begin when it comes to this topic?
It's kind of, well, first off, I'll say we are not frogs. Okay. Okay. What does he mean by that?
Yes.
So I'll get to it.
Not a frog.
We're not a frog. That's a take-home lesson. But
I agree.
Let me say.
You're right. Shoo!
You can kiss a frog, becomes a human. But aside from that, I'll explain what I mean by that in a second. But to kind of put some perspective on this, it's sort of like trying to talk to a flat earther. So if you look at the land, or it depends on where you live, I guess, if you're in plains of Texas or something, the world looks flat.
Right.
And I can see, and there still are a lot of people who believe that this is all, wrong, conspiracy, whatever. The Earth is really flat. And how do you prove it? Let's say we had never been in orbit, never taken pictures of the Earth, whatever. The old Greek, the way the ancient Greeks did it, is they put these posts up in the ground, vertical posts, and they measured the angle of the shadow. And, as you go around the Earth, the shadows change. And they actually calculated the diameter of the Earth and all this sort of thing.
Wow.
Now, the reason I'm bringing that up is common sense would sort of, looking around you, you'd say the Earth is flat. Okay, you could say, Mike, you say it's not flat. Well, I'd have to get into all these angles and stuff, and you're going to lose people.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Okay, it's kind of like this embryo debate. People say, well, life begins at conception. Well, where else would it begin? Well,
Right.
I got to get into a little bit of the weeds. I got to explain some of the biology, and we're not a frog. What do I mean by that?
Yeah, we're ready. Take us to school.
All right. So when a frog, and by the way, some of the opponents of this idea that life begins at 14 days instead of the fertilization of an egg, point to the frog. And we're not frogs. So when a frog egg is fertilized, almost essentially immediately, it's one frog. It's destined to become one frog. Humans, that's not the case. And it's part of the reason, we don't lay our eggs in a water environment. Women have a uterus, and the fertilized egg has to travel. Here I'm getting into the weeds, right? The egg has to travel down the fallopian tube and implant in the uterus. And so the biological realities, if we do all the math with the angles, the posts, and the shadows, and all this, if you get into the biological equivalent to that, biologists are 100% certain, there's no debate about this, that individuation, the beginning of an individual human life, begins 13 or 14 days. It's right in that time frame. It's not at the fertilization of an egg. How do we prove that? Again, the angles, shadows. Well, the simple way to look at it, as you pointed out, is twinning. So you can have identical twins born, and what is that? Well, identical twins are one fertilized egg cell that sometime in that first couple weeks splits into two. They can actually split into four, and you get identical quadruplets. That happens naturally. Well, if the fertilized egg cell was the beginning of life, well, how can you have four lives? Actually, something similar can occur. Two fertilized eggs can stick together and make one individual made of two different cell types. You may have heard of hermaphrodism, where a person has their part female, part male. Might have an ovary on one side of their body and a testicle on another. They're a mix of different people. So what does all that biology tell us, without, again, going into all the molecular details? It tells us that the individual human life begins at 14 days. That isn't to say that from an ethical standpoint, even at 14 days, that's a human life or should be considered a human life. That's a whole entirely different argument, which potentially Jen will get into. But I'm just saying from a scientific standpoint, it makes zero sense biologically to say life begins at conception. It's myth. It's unfounded myth. It's just simply not biological fact.
And I think this is, well, I'm just going to say it. One of the things that I try to point out for people is there are living things happening when an egg is fertilized. Living things. Sure. That is not the same thing as saying this is a baby or this is a child. And that, to me, is a very important distinction to make, right? Because sure, if it does continue through gestation, it will become a human, not a horse, not a plant, right?
That's true.
That is the only option. But when if we want to talk about babies or children, right? That's not what we're talking about when we've got something you can barely see on a microscope, right? Under a microscope. So I always say, well, yeah, I mean, life is happening immediately. That isn't the piece here that we're trying
That's
to
right.
talk about. We're trying to talk qualitatively
Yeah.
about what form of life, what stage in that very long development, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So how does this fit into IVF then? I mean, I know it stands for in vitro fertilization. I've had several friends of mine
Yeah.
and families go through the process to
Right.
have children. And so it's been interesting, Jen, I'm sure you've noticed it too. It seems like the IVF thing has gotten a lot more traction in these right-wing fundamentalist spaces. A lot of people like Al Mohler, now the president of the SBC, got the SBC to actually pass like a statement saying essentially we condemn this, which is to me, I'm just like, whoa, this is like really taking off. But I'm just kind of curious, can one of you, whoever, kind of walk us through what IVF actually is and why? I don't know, maybe we'll just start there. What is IVF? What actually happens with IVF? And then we'll continue on.
Let me handle it. So
Go, please.
So,
that's why you're here, right?
I didn't want to assume, but I figured the scientist, right?
Yeah.
All right. Well, I'm sort of an expert in two ways. One, I know a lot about IVF because that's where these stem cells came from.
Yeah.
But also, I have 4 children that came from IVF, so
Wow.
I'm very grateful for the procedure, as many people are.
Exactly.
Millions. So what is it? So usually it's because of women that are maybe waiting, late in their career. In the modern world, we do so much schooling and everything else. And as you get older, the number of egg cells you release that are available for fertilization decreases, and or the quality of those egg cells can decrease, so that your chances of becoming pregnant can, diminish with time. That's often the reason. There's other reasons people just can't have babies, in other words. So what do you do? So
what do you do?
in IVF, you take egg cells from the mother, and you take sperm from the potential father, and you just mix them together in a little plastic dish. And of course, there's millions of sperm, and one of them will fertilize the egg cell, really not differently than they would normally, except it's in a dish as opposed to in the body. And so in vitro literally means in glass. It means, it means outside the body.
That's
vivo,
helpful.
In vivo.
It is, right?
Yeah. In vivo would be, in vivo fertilization. No one talks about that.
Who makes up these terms? Why are they so weird sounding? Well, that's why. There's always a reason.
There's a Latin and Greek reason.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. So you fertilize the egg cell in the dish. That's all it is. There are more modern twists and turns of this, which had their own ethical issues. You can now sample these embryos and choose that you want to have a male or female embryo implanted or whatever. And these are all other issues. But standard IVF, you just help the egg cell get fertilized. You provide that assistance. They call it assistive reproductive technologies, sometimes ART. So you're helping people become pregnant. So these first cells start developing. And let me just add one more thing.
Please.
This was all thought through ethically by the Mary Warnock Commission in the United Kingdom, where a lot of this work began. Scholars, theologians, as in this letter that you and Jennifer mentioned, really thought this through. And they all agreed, look, this cluster of cells, if there's no cells of the human body there, certainly not a heart or a brain, nothing. There's not one cell of a human body yet. They're these unformed cells that can still twin and so on. If they're used for the purposes of making babies, and you don't go past this 14-day limit, then this is, really in the benefit of mankind. It's pro-life, and there's no individual human life there, and so on. So that's an important part of the whole history of this. So then that fertilized egg cell, you let it develop for a few days to make sure the cells are healthy. You can just tell that by looking at them under the microscope. And then you pull the little cluster of cells, we call it an embryo, but it's just a little cluster of cells up, and you implant it in the woman's uterus. And hopefully you'll get a pregnancy. A lot of the reasons, normally you implant In normal reproduction and normal pregnancies, half or even the majority of fertilized egg cells never attach to the uterus. It's an important part of this. And
I think we need to clarify what you just said, because I was still thinking IVF with what you just said.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I got off
no,
on a
that's
tangent.
okay.
Well, both in IVF, but I was going to say in natural reproduction,
right.
Most embryos never stick. It's an important thing to think about when you think, would God consider this a human life? Well, wow,
No.
he's letting a lot. The majority of people walking the golden streets up in heaven that you meet are going to be 4-cell and 2-cell embryos because
we need to be clear here. Yeah, I know you're being funny, but that's actually a little confusing.
Okay, IVF though is like that. So typically, if you just implanted one, you may not get it to attach, and so typically physicians will implant 2 or 3 these fertilized egg cells. And that's why many of the families you see with IVF will have twins and triplets, is because multiple embryos are implanted.
Right.
Jen, what did you want to clarify?
Yeah, I just want to be clear that as a natural part of human sexuality, human reproduction, when you have a hetero couple having sex, a woman, it's potentially 2/3. Isn't that right, Mike?
Yeah,
up to 2/3.
It's hard to tell because
because we can't actually. But there are females with uteruses and vaginas have fertilized eggs that just don't attach, and that they just are flushed out of their system. Up to 2/3. Again, this is sketchy, but the point is, from my perspective, this is a deeply important element of human reality, right? And it's just okay. It is just okay. Could you imagine if every single one of those had actually gone to gestation? So that's just a part of human bodies that people. I didn't know until I started talking to Mike about this. I just didn't know that number. I didn't know about that reality. Or if I did in middle school, I've forgotten it,
Totally. In fact, let me go ahead and just read that paragraph that you have in the statement, because you actually covered this really well. And this was also, when I read this, I thought, that's a great point. Like, this is a great point that really undermines some of these more, I'm going to call it just very extreme positions on IVF. So here's what you say in this statement. And again, friends, I'll link this below, either in the description or in the show notes. It says, quote, "A second important point is that scientific evidence strongly suggests that up to 2/3 of fertilized human eggs do not develop past an early embryo stage, and that they do not give rise to a viable pregnancy. The language of, quote, life at conception ignores this fact about human reproduction. To put it differently, if early embryos are in fact children, as the Alabama court insists, which is one of their points that they made, then we would need to consider as an unrecognized massive healthcare crisis the millions of, quote, babies dying in the first days of embryonic development. If pre-implantation embryos are in fact babies, are we also not morally compelled to spend billions of healthcare research dollars on preventing early embryo death? This would have an enormous negative impact on healthcare research that currently helps millions of living men, women, and children."
We debated about this part of the letter, Tim, because of we wanted to make sure people kind of holding people's feet to the fire on taking this seriously, but we had a hard time coming up with language that was clear that we're not actually kidding here. Like, how do you get them out of the sewer system? Like, what are we talking about? How do you save all of those? If those are actually babies, how do we harvest all of those?
1,000%. I mean, I want to just point this out, and then we'll get back to you, Mike, to continue on. This is by the way, let me just say this is really helpful for me, I'm sure for the audience too, to get some clarity around all of these things, including the procedure and what we're talking about. And I still have more questions we're going to unpack. But this is actually a very important point, because if this very far right pro-life thing, term used loosely, really cared about what they say they cared about, you would expect to see legislation mandating billions of dollars of research to prevent every single miscarriage possible, right? Or however you phrase this language in this paragraph, right?
Yeah, it's not even miscarriage. Yeah,
it's not the right word.
This
I don't know what to say.
Disposal of.
but they don't, right? Because everyone understands that this does happen, and they don't see it as murder. It only becomes this when it becomes a political talking point, or I think to pass a nefarious agenda long term that really ends up wanting to control people's bodies and what they do with it. So I just think that this is a very important point to hit, because if you take the logic to its outworking, you end up in a position like this, and obviously those people aren't pushing for these positions, right? So something isn't adding up here.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, they're not even aware of it. Yeah. They're not even aware of it.
So to reiterate here, to make sure I'm on the same page, essentially IVF, as I understand it so far, is take a sperm or sperms, take some eggs or an egg and put it into a glass tube. It fertilizes, and then you implant it into a uterus. And in hopes that it takes and that a baby is formed over time. Is that kind of the idea?
To the wall of the uterus and does its thing. Yeah.
Yes.
I think it'd also be helpful to clarify, Mike, what you said before about how small what this actually is, right? In terms of the cells, the cluster, I think that'd be helpful to clarify.
Yeah. Let me just tell you a little anecdote. I was back in the embryo debates about the embryonic stem cell debates. The biotechnology, focus group was held in Washington, D.C., and I happened to be there. We had all these people sitting around, and so the moderator was saying, okay, we take these embryos that are being thrown away, and they used to make these stem cells that could cure all these diseases. And everyone was really troubled by this. They saw it as a balancing act, of destruction of life to save a life. And, how do they think this through? And at one point, the moderator at my request, actually, took a pen and a piece of paper and made a little dot and held it up and said, what we're talking about is a cluster of cells that haven't yet formed any cell of the human body, and it's smaller than this dot. Mm-hmm. And the lights came on, and everybody's eyes around the room. They said, oh, I thought you were talking about this little thing with a beating heart and all this. There's a massive, so we use the word embryo, see?
But in my head, that still is a small human somehow, even though I know it's not. I still picture little baby human.
Totally. Yeah, totally.
What, 200, 300 years ago, there was this homunculus idea, within every sperm is a little human being.
Yes, exactly. No, for a long time.
It doesn't work that way.
Yeah, they've been thinking that forever.
Yeah, I know. Huh. So we're made of cells, living cells. And if there's no cells, there's no person. And, so I know I'm getting into the weeds here.
But like an embryo is just a cluster of cells. It's not a cluster of particular body part cells. It's just a bunch of cells, right?
It's very clear. That's not being callous. That's just describing what it actually is.
No, I'm just talking biology.
Yeah, like that. It's just biology. We're not trying to devalue anything. We're just saying this is what it is. At this stage in the game, this is what we're talking about here.
That's right.
It's literally a cluster of cells.
That's it.
Period.
If I pulled a hair from my head, there's more cells there at the end of the hair than there are in this little microscopic cluster. If you look at the point of a pin, it's pretty sharp. Yeah. It'll balance on the point of a pin, a little microscopic cluster of cells. Okay, so on the one hand, that's the reality.
So how is that human, right?
It's not debatable. This isn't an opinion. I'm not promoting.
It's a scientific
people
fact.
Say, scientists agree life begins. No, scientists
I hear that
don't
all
agree.
the time. So they don't agree.
See, that's why I made that comment about living things are happening versus
I hear it all the
human.
time. Yeah. Scientists all agree life begins at conception. Therefore, abortion is murder.
There's floating on the internet, there's a survey, I won't name names, but there was a survey that was done that no serious scholar would consider an accurate or statistically significant survey.
Right.
But there are people who, in the scientific community, of course, that hold to this view that life begins at conception, regardless of the facts. Of course, there are people out there, and you poll them, and they will agree with statements like this. But on this letter is Scott Gilbert, Dr. Gilbert, who's wrote the standard textbook of embryology. He's one of the most respected embryologists in the world. And, he certainly would agree with what we're saying. This is a biological fact. And why is it important to get the facts right?
Yeah.
Because we're talking about families, people that want to have children.
Right.
This is why Jen and I, who started this letter, we were talking about this and we thought, this is really important. Well, you read in the Bible about Abraham's wife, Sarah, right?
Yep.
Who wanted to have a child. I mean, they actually agonized over this, the inability to have children. And it means so much to so many people. And to have, I'm sorry, I'm getting my soapbox here, but
No,
to have people who were completely ignorant of the biological facts throw out this statement that life begins at conception that has no basis in biology. Jen perhaps can talk about what the Old Testament, the Bible says about life and so on. But from a scientific standpoint, there's no basis in biology, and to potentially then talk about legislation that could impact the reproductive freedom of people to have families, it really gets some of us, Jen and I included, rather energized. This is important. It's important to get this right.
One brief observation, Jen, is that okay? And then I'll hand it over to you. Is that all right?
No.
First off, let me just say, Mike, you do whatever you want. You're more than welcome to drop names on this podcast anytime. Okay, we have no problem. So it's up to everyone, all my guests, of course, but don't feel like you have to censor yourself for my sake. It's very interesting. So I spend too much time on YouTube, both as a creator and as a consumer, and I've discovered this world of like the creationist people who like debating the non-creationist folks. There's someone, his name is James Torr. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of him. He's part of the Discovery of Life Institute. Anyway, so
I know the institute.
Okay, so I've been watching all of these actual biologists who have like these big YouTube channels just spend time kind of debunking all of these claims, right? Mm-hmm. And I just hear a lot of the same themes in what you're saying here, where it's like, why are there people out there who are intentionally committed to dogma over their data, right? They are committed to this presuppositional belief of X. And then they will either twist or manipulate or just ignore data that says otherwise. And it's interesting because it's one thing as an individual to have that belief. Yeah. It's a different thing when you are convinced that your God wants you to write laws to make everyone else succumb to that belief, right? And that's for me where things go from, hey, I think you're kind of weird and honestly I disagree with you, but hey, you do you, to no, I'm sorry, Alabama Supreme Court. Like, no, this is really problematic because to your point, and I think I might even name the episode this, IVF seems quite pro-life based on how you're describing it. It actually helps people who can't conceive have children. That's a beautiful thing, right? Yeah, so it's got to drive you crazy, Mike, and you too, Jen, as someone who you've spent thousands of hours reading, learning, you've had peer-reviewed studies done, you've received critique, you've changed your mind, you've done the hard work. You've done the hard work that people like me get to benefit from. To have someone on Instagram with 1 million followers say IVF is bad and it kills children, and they're like, yeah, you're right. Like this is a modern genocide. And you're like, are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? It's gonna drive you crazy.
Can I just add a little point? If many of your viewers have an evangelical background, Jen and I were talking about Francis Schaeffer, who in many ways, with his film series of C. Everett Koop and so on, I think started the evangelical passionate movement, at least in the regard to pro-life movement.
Totally.
I knew Francis Schaeffer. I discussed a lot of things with him. I never discussed this particular issue because, he died before this issue came up, really. But I'm confident that he would have been aghast at where we're headed on this. He was proposing Christians being involved in government and letting their voices be heard.
Yeah.
But he would have been horrified about people not doing their homework, attacking reproductive rights without understanding the basic theological and biological facts behind this. It's not what he had in mind.
No, that's really helpful, by the way, to hear from someone who actually knows Francis. That's good to know. Hi friends, if you're enjoying this video, I have a favor to ask. The New Evangelicals is a 501c3 nonprofit, and if you looked around at all, you've probably noticed that we don't offer member subscriptions on YouTube or Patreon options. The reason for this is very simple. It's been our mission since the beginning to offer all of our content and community resources completely paywall free. What this means is that we are completely dependent on the generosity of people like you who donate to make this work possible and accessible for all. all. If our content has helped you, would you consider donating to keep it all going? You can find the link in the description of this video, and to be very clear, this is not about giving to God or something like that. We're not a church, and this is not a tithe. The ask is so simple. If our work has helped you, would you be willing to help us make this content accessible to more and more people? All donations made in the US are tax deductible, and every bit helps. Thank you for your generosity. Jen, let's get into the theological side. Obviously, in the world that we occupy, a lot of this comes from the supposed clear stance that the Bible has. In fact, I actually have this book here. It's written by Alicia Childers and Tim Barnett. It's called The Deconstruction of Christianity. It's pretty much a very evangelical fundamentalist defense of why people like me who have changed my views are heretics. But one of the things they talk about is, thank you. Yeah, I really appreciate it from them. One of the things they talk about in the book, though, is they talk about how sometimes the Bible isn't clear, but other times it is very clear, like on issues of homosexuality, and they mentioned abortion. And I was like, really interesting. Like, is the Bible clear? So, Jen, I love bringing you on to kind of obliterate all of my own personal categories. In fact, the first time we talked offline, I was like, oh, I got a lot to wrestle with about how I navigate this stuff after you gave me, just your expert opinion and stuff. So talk to me when it comes to the Bible and abortion. Are there texts that address this topic? If so, what do they have to say? And if not, where do these people get this stuff from? Like, enlighten us. I'm so curious.
Okay, sure. Well, I'll say that there are two primary things that I think factor into this conversation.
Yeah.
One is when people say, and this is what the Alabama court ruling, so the Supreme Court judge in Alabama was hanging almost all of his claims upon, which is the idea that humans are made in God's image.
Right.
So that's Genesis 1, right? Verse 27, 28, right? Let us make humankind in our image, in the image of God, and so therefore God did that, right? In the image of God, God made all the people, male and female, blah, blah, blah. And so the claim, so this is a theological claim. It's not an actual factual claim. It's a theological claim. And one of the things about that piece is, what do people mean? What do people think it means when they say in God's image? Which part of humans reflect the essence of God? And it is a debated subject. It is whether you're Christian, Jewish or not, right? It's which part of us? Is it the fact that we have a soul? Is it the fact that we create? Because God has literally just spent 6 days creating. And so is it that element of us? Is it our morality? Is it our ability to communicate? Like what? Sorry. Just had a little incident with my water bottle. What is it about us that reflects Godness? And one of the things that's right. And so I think it's important just to sit with the fact that this is a poetic claim that someone made 3,000 years ago. I'm not challenging it so much as just saying, let's hold that with an open hand. Also, there's no certainty of what that means. And at the end of the day, whatever that is, let's just claim it's something. Okay, let's just claim that what they meant when they said that is that we are ensouled. We have some sort of spirit within us. I'm just grabbing one of the many options. That element, characteristic about humans is not present in an embryo.
Right. Whatever
that is, right? It's not present for several months even. In the gestation period, right? So yes, this whole thing about IVF is just focusing on IVF, but it is, as you said, Tim, it's also about taking down abortion. And so it's important to me to try to span that whole, spectrum here if I can. It looks like you want to say something.
If you don't mind, I want to tease this out because first off, I've never really thought about what is the image of God thing that we're talking about.
Exactly.
You gave me several viable options. Maybe it's all, maybe it's none. I don't know. But they're worth considering. Like, okay, what exactly are we talking about? And by the way, as someone who is still very much a Jesus person, I just want to say that I affirm that statement. I do believe, and it's part of my personal ethic, right? That I believe all people are made in the image of God, which is why we're committed as an organization, and me personally, to non-dehumanization, right? Because I believe that there's a sacredness. But that is a theological claim. And what does it exactly mean? I don't know if I could tell you. I don't know if I could tell you exactly what it is about the human thing or, a species that I think is sacred in that way, except for it helps me really be careful and cautious with how I treat my fellow man, right? For the sake of hopefully pushing for a better path forward that leads to all human flourishing. So I think that's a really important disclaimer, because a lot of times when you grow up in this world, you just take statements like that for granted and don't actually critically examine or think through, well, what exactly do we mean? And then I'm thinking about Genesis 2, and you tell me if I'm wrong here because you're the scholar, but there's this statement of God breathing into the human or the man the breath of life, like the breath of God, right? And so it's like, well, is that when the image of God gets stamped on, when someone takes their first breath? I mean, is that even a viable thing to consider? I don't know, but again, maybe it's a little more complicated than what we've been told of. The moment conception happens, if IVF happens, or if the process stops, or if you have an abortion at day 10, congratulations, you just killed. It's the equivalent of killing a 5-year-old. It's like maybe it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm. It is. And a couple thoughts, and now I just dropped them all. One that I did want to comment on, though, is even within religious traditions, there's a discrepancy in terms of when this fertilized egg and cluster of cells, and then at what stage in the development we're going to call it a viable human, right? And therefore something that we want to ascribe some form of human rights or legal rights to, right?
Right.
That varies. And in fact, there are Jewish traditions, communities today who say it doesn't start until the child takes its own first breath. Like it's up for conversation up until that point. That is huge, Tim, because
pretty intense.
It is really intense.
Wow.
We're not even talking viability at that point. We're talking
right.
its first breath, which is why your comment about Genesis 2, and God doing a little CPR there in Genesis 2. I can't help but want to say that first human is not male, by the way, in Genesis 2. I know you know that.
I'm getting better, though. See how I said human? I said human, right? I didn't
you
say
did say man. I'm sorry.
Oh, did I? Did I? I thought I said human.
It's okay.
I'll do better.
I love you, Tim.
I'll do better. I love you.
Yeah. So, what do we mean, right? So the breathing in thing in Genesis 2, I think that's more about, is that life? Well, it's a fully formed human. Like God just did a little mold of a human, like this is clay model, not embryo, not a cluster of cells, right? We're talking, and when the description in Genesis 1, therefore God made them male and female in the image of God, God created them. Like we're talking about fully formed humans. This is so mythical. This is so fantastic, right?
Right.
It's not what we're talking about when we talk about the full spectrum of human reproduction. We're talking, right? So it is a theological claim about something important or sacred or special or separate from other mammals and animals. That's what we're getting at, but it's not the same thing as the whole process, right? There's the humans in God's image, and then there's the other piece, which is there are a handful of passages in the Hebrew Bible in particular that challenge this idea. When we look at, so there's the Exodus 21, 22 and 23, right? That talks about if a man causes a woman to miscarry and loses her fetus, right? We just have however much the father of that child thinks needs to be repaid or whatever, but they're not put to death for killing a human. It's just you've lost something that had potential, right? If the woman subsequently dies, then that's when things get sketchy. Like that's a life. So even the biblical writers themselves looked at a fetus, a gestating fetus, differently than they did the woman carrying it, which is astounding considering how women are so objectified, right?
Right. No, totally.
and are depicted primarily being baby makers. So the fact that even the biblical writers themselves, and who, this is the thing that women are valued for, is doing this thing of producing children. Like even they are able to separate these two as qualitatively different. right? And then, there are passages, I'm sorry, I'm fidgeting because my sound is going weird. There are passages, right, that like in Psalm 139 that talk about God knowing you as you, right,
Yes.
formed in your mother's womb.
Very classic passage used for this.
Yeah, yeah. And I don't have a response to that, to be honest. I think it's more, that is another poetic claim, theological claim that I think is lovely and beautiful.
Right.
But the Bible itself is not consistent on this issue, right? So, we're looking at Genesis 1:27, 28, I'm so used to talking about Genesis 1:28. It's 1:26 and 27, talking about making humans in God's image. That is lovely. Okay, so humans are all sacred and valuable. Actually, the Bible, the Hebrew Bible itself and the Newer Testament challenge that idea that all human life is valuable and sacred.
Don't make me too uncomfortable, Jane. You can't do that to me. But you're right, though. You're right. I mean, think about
it needs to be pointed out.
It has to. It has to.
That's right. Yeah.
Yes,
so it does. There are lovely moments of God knew you before you were even a thing, but then there are others that challenge that and say, guess what? You did the wrong thing. Zap.
Yeah. Or
you wanked off.
Those people.
Zap.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah. Or go kill every woman and children and man and piece of cattle on this person's land. I mean,
don't tell me that human life is sacred throughout the whole Bible. Don't even tell me that in the Newer Testament, Tim, because if God, as depicted, right, is willing to send those on his left hand into utter destruction.
Yeah.
That is the full in the face of human life. All human life is sacred. Sorry, I'm about to drop the F-bomb. Like, no,
you can if you want. I mean, I'm not going to stop you.
I know, but I'm trying to be polite,
Can I stop you from dropping the bomb and interject something?
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Just to reinforce what Jennifer said about Exodus, a little anecdote. The first stem cell lines that Bush talked about in 2001 came from Israel, actually, and from an IVF clinic in Israel. And around that time, or shortly thereafter, I won't name names, but I was having dinner with the
But
chief,
you can, but you don't have to.
You can.
no, out of respect for the individual.
Totally
this was the chief justice of the Supreme Court of Israel I was having dinner with, or the president. I can't remember exactly what their title is, but it's equivalent of the chief justice.
Okay.
And so I asked, in a very objective, scientific manner, not biasing him, we established, a rapport. And so I asked him a legal question, which I didn't think he was going to answer. I said, a case is before you, and I described the Exodus situation. A woman is pregnant, and let's say she's, 1 week from delivering the baby, full term. And a neighbor comes over and does violence on her and kills the baby, the still unborn fetus. It comes before you in the Supreme Court of Israel. Is it murder? And if all these assumptions that evangelicals are bringing to this about life beginning, conception, and so on, you would say, absolutely, right? Probably the Louisiana judge would have said, absolutely, full term. He said, no, it's loss of property. And I said, and what do you base that on? And he said, in Israel, we base law on the Torah. And it's very clear in the Torah, it's loss of property. It's not a life deserving of the protections of, for murder and so on until it takes its first breath. Wow. Consistent with what Jennifer said.
Yeah,
I think you have to take, I know that he's not a theologian.
No, right.
But wow, I mean, that's how law is interpreted based on the Torah in Israel. And so for Christians to say,
right. Yeah.
So, I think you need to consider that fact as well.
I promise you, my audience and myself, we're considering all of this.
Yes, I know.
Just like our head is like, wow.
And one of the things, this may be out of line here, so you can just, cut it out, I suppose, if you don't like what I'm about to say here, Tim. But one of the ways that I actually raised the topic of abortion in my intro courses, which I did entirely in context and appropriate to the occasion, which is we've been talking about the themes in the Bible. One of them is, this thing about women and baby making. So but I would ask students without telling them where I'm headed. I would ask them, what does John 10:10 mean to you? Like that I've come that you've had life and have it to the fullest. What does full life look like to you? And I would write it up on the board. They're like listing all the things, healthcare, roof over my head, food, clothes, a partner, family. I'm like, yep, that's right. And so if that's what we mean by life and having full life and being able to support that, then we need to be able to talk about, the people who are bringing children into the world being able to support that and do that. And that's a different way of talking about what the Bible says on a topic to me. And that's, I'm being sneaky. I'm taking it entirely out of context. I will own that. It's entirely out of context. Like, this is not what that passage is talking about.
Right.
But scripture is going to be used the way scripture is going to be used. And so
yes,
there's an element of being able to step back and say, life, are you able to live it well? That's a value that's in the Christian Bible. And that doesn't factor into the conversation typically when people are talking about abortion. Yeah. And people tend to put the woman not even as relevant in the conversation. A woman is already being called a mother. Yep. She's, it's just a given that she's going to bring a child into the world, instead of talking about the woman who is pregnant and what does she need and what is she able to do, right? So what I think I made a leap here in our conversation, but I wanted to put it out there because the conversation around women's health and reproduction is being determined by men and is very much reflecting a typical biblical theme about women, which is that women are property and they are predominantly useful for their baby making purposes. Thank you very much. Right. They drop out of narratives after they produce the children in the book of Genesis, right? The biblical themes here are actually part of the problem of focusing on protecting a dot over the reality of the woman who is looking at this situation, right? She needs to be put first. I mean, when you listen to the conversations about abortion, people put the fetus, the gestating fetus, before the woman. As if, and people will use the language, we need to protect them. I'm like, actually, no, we don't. We already aren't feeding all the children on the planet. We don't need to protect a thing that, yes, could become, but that's, when the language and the framing is always putting the thing that in there first, this is very biblical. Yeah. And that's part of the problem in my mind.
You can't make me that uncomfortable, Jen. I got to edit that part out now. I'm sorry. My audience cannot hear it. We are Bible believing. God said it. The Bible says it. That settles it, Christians.
I know.
Listen, I know for a lot of people, and listen, just transparently, right? Yeah. I'm still working through things like what you just said, right? Where like being biblical is the problem because of so much of my worldview was formed. Granted,
yes,
but we have to be willing to be challenged and think about those things. And one thing I appreciate about Dan McClellan a lot, who you do work with as well, is that you do all the work. I just listen. He says that we negotiate the text. And that actually has freed me up in a lot of ways to be like, good. Yeah, I want to negotiate the text in a way that hopefully pushes us towards human flourishing, not away from it, right? And that includes being realistic about things in this complicated collection of ancient texts that we call the Bible, there's some problems here, and we have to be able to acknowledge that and be willing to wrestle with it. And I know for people, especially people who might be listening who are new to deconstruction or who are kind of just coming out of like that world, that's really unsettling. I totally get that. In fact, Jen, that's one thing I appreciate so much about your book is that you handle it, and you're so often saying like, okay, maybe you're uncomfortable here. That's okay. Let's just take a minute and take this in.
Take a deep breath.
Like it's a very kind approach when you don't have to be so maybe nuanced or maybe so comforting. But I appreciate that, right? Because we have to be able to have the honest conversation. I have one thing I want to add. Then I want to give you guys a hard question because I think that for both of these, they've been you've been really we thought through this stuff. I have a few questions I have to ask before we wrap up.
Sure.
But one thing that I wanted to add to this conversation that really maybe this is even more morbid, Jen, than than some other stuff we talked about. But one of the moments where for me, I thought something doesn't add up with like this pro-life ethic I've been given is that, and my understanding of like heaven and hell in Christianity is that, I was taught that, well, if a child dies really young, they go to heaven to live with God forever and all of eternity. I'm like, well, not to sound like weird, but if you believe that, like a fetus is a fully formed human being, isn't the most loving thing to do to send them to heaven as quickly as possible? No, I don't subscribe to that, but like, isn't that how the logic would work? So even that for me, I mean, I had to be like maybe in my early 20s. I'm like, I don't like how that makes me feel at all thinking about that. Like, I'm really uncomfortable. But if there's this Christian ethic of heaven, well, no, I would say right-wing fundamentalist idea of like heaven, but like also you want to mandate that people have babies 24/7, and then you don't want to take care of those babies at all, and then when they become full adults, especially if they're black babies, they become criminals and thugs. Like, I don't like, things are not adding up for me. Like the math is not mathing. So I think that there are a lot of these moments for people who grew up in this space, like the three of us and others, where we start thinking about some of the logical conclusions and we go, no, something isn't right here. So I wanted to call that out for me as far as what kind of helped me start to think more, maybe just differently about this conversation that led us to where we are now, which I really appreciate. So, okay, here's the big question we have to ask. I have to ask it. I have to be intellectually honest with myself and with my audience. Help me think about some of the ethics and around this stuff. Not so much the IVF or stem cell research. I think we kind of established that, but you did bring up, Mike, to your point that there's some more gray areas of like, well, we can choose, like if we want, an embryo to have this or to have that, and like how we think about like genetics and stuff. And honestly, like, I forgive the pun, but like, is there a point to where we go, are we just kind of playing God here in very unethical ways? I remember reading a study around Down syndrome in Iceland and how like, because people could detect this gene early, there was just a real push to erase that type of person from being born. I'm like, I'm really uncomfortable now. Even saying that makes me feel uncomfortable. So I would just love to hear from two people who are really, leading their fields of study, how you think about some of the more complicated and topics like that and how we handle it being ethical and, respecting the sacredness. I mean, maybe we should say of like human life, etc. What maybe, Mike, we can start with you. What are some of your thoughts on this?
I think that's a good example because if you remember the film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, which was Francis Schaeffer's film series just on really the abortion issue. He showed a child with trisomy 21 and implied that, secular humanists would have destroyed that person. Right. Before they were born. So I guess that's where your question is leading, is all the complexities of where the new science and the new medicine is taking us. And I think I share with you your concern of the gravity of some of these new technologies. And I'll be... one thing you'll learn about me is I just speak what's on my mind. I visited, again, an unnamed IVF clinic that was doing these procedures back in the stem cell era. I mean, we're well into the stem cell era at this point, but when it was just beginning, that was doing what's called PGD. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It's pre-gestational diagnosis. So you pluck one little cell off from these cluster of cells and then do genetics and see, for instance, do they carry trisomy 21 or other diseases? Some of these diseases are devastating. I mean, the child will be in pain for 2 weeks, screaming, and then die.
You don't 18 is another one.
You don't want to bring a child like that into the world if you don't have to.
Right.
And so I was talking to this individual, again unnamed, and the callousness of this individual, he was like laughing. He said, "Hey, we can make super people, we can screen for hundreds of genetic. I can give you a blue-eyed, blonde-haired, And I really felt uncomfortable more with the callousness that he was bringing to what is a very serious ethically challenging area. I'm not saying PGD is bad. I think it's wonderful. But yes, I agree. The new technologies are bringing us into an era that thoughtful people with a heart, people with a strong sense of right or wrong, whether they're a Christian or someone who's given up their faith or is a secular humanist who never believed in Christianity or Judaism, whatever our background is, especially in the United States, the whole theory of the United States is a collective sense of making a social contract about what kind of a country we want to have. And I think we need to have a dialogue about where these new technologies are taking us. IVF, I think, is a really bad idea for Christians to attack it on multiple dimensions, as we've already described. Stem cell research similarly. But yes, there are new technologies. I'm aware of work being done in laboratories that I disagree with on ethical grounds. And so I think shows like what you're doing here, informing the populace in general, is what we need. We need dialogue, and we need to find a path to make our country the kind of country we're proud of, and we think would honor our religious heritage.
Yeah, that's good. What are your thoughts on this, Jen? I'm curious.
Yeah, I have two primary thoughts on this, and it's probably not what you're hoping I'm going to say or whatever, but the first is this just drives home to me the importance of education, because people who do not understand, for instance, how delightful a person with Down syndrome is,
right?
That it's a person who doesn't understand that's going to say this shouldn't happen. But the reality there is there are people who've had children with Down syndrome, and then they're scientists, and they're trying to consider whether they're going to have a second child. And like one of the couple who is the scientist is like, I don't want to do that again. And the wife is like, what are you talking about? Like our daughter is amazing,
Right.
So this is reality, that people have discomfort with things that are different or unfamiliar or whatever. And so the bigger picture to me is around the humanities and understanding what it is to be a human and alive, and to what format does that need to be in. I think of the ethics courses I've taken and in seminary and undergraduate and graduate school, and none of these are simple. And that's the point. There needs to be serious deliberation of different perspectives and different sides to it all.
Yeah.
So I'm not interested in creating a certain race of people and look at, all those things. But I think that what is needed is information and education. The other thing I just wanted to throw in there, and this is when we talk about bringing children into the world, what I often want to say to people is, let's also talk about what you're putting that woman or the person with a uterus through for however many months, and what that is doing to that person, regardless of if this is terminated or bringing into the world just for 2 weeks, this infant who will suffer for we wouldn't want to do that to the infant. We also don't want to do that to the person who's got to labor for 9 months and then also 1000%. Deal with that kind of pain.
Yeah, good point.
So the conversations need to include I keep not saying women because there are people who are men who have uteruses. So, but like the people who get pregnant, right?
Yeah,
we need to put them in these conversations as well.
Yeah. Well, I was hoping for some binary black and white. And here's the out. You know me.
Right, and you know me.
One of the things I think about as someone who is still very much Christian, or as much as I can be, and still learning how to be it, is I do think about, speaking of negotiating the Bible, the motif of wisdom, Lady Wisdom. And it's like, yes, I think about that a lot. Like, how do we, make wise, informed decisions together that hopefully promote the well-being of all of our neighbors? And I think you're right, Jen. When my wife got pregnant with our first, we have a 2 and a 4-year-old. We had the first big doctor's appointment. It was like an hour long. They go through all the stuff, and thanks to genetic testing, all that stuff, they can really give us insight. And they mentioned, hey, we do test for all of these different things. They mentioned trisomy 18. Now I had no clue. I'm my first, time watching someone I love being pregnant, right? So I'm just learning it as we go along. And they just said, if the fetus comes back with this diagnosis, like, here's what it looks like. It depends on what level, and they gave us all the chances of viability once the baby was born. And I never had to confront a possible reality that, this test might come back a certain way. And then I said, well, okay, and then what? And we live in New Jersey, which is a very liberal state and very good when it comes to women's autonomy with their reproductive health. And they said, well, at that point, you have to make a decision. And I was like, what kind of, that decision? And, it was the first time I was really confronted with a real world scenario of this. We might be put in a place where we have to make not a decision we want to make at all, but me, my partner, and my medical provider should be able to make that decision together of how we proceed. Because to your point, after watching my wife have 2 children, pregnancy is a big ask of the human body. It's unbelievable that the body can do that. It's almost miraculous. It's crazy. Right. But it's a lot. And that was the moment for me where I said, I'm glad that this hypothetical scenario is put in our hands and not the state mandating, well, there's a heartbeat there, so sorry, you got to keep going, really, truthfully. Now, thankfully, both my kids were born healthy and were born great. I'm super happy for that. But that was a moment that really shifted my view from like this outlaw all abortion kind of stance. And I know we're kind of going between IVF and abortion. They're very different things in a lot of different ways. But, that was one of the moments that really transformed my perspective on whose decision should this ultimately be. Newsflash, not the government's, based on something that the government would never be able to actually know about because it's not their business to know about, right? So anyway, that's my soapbox moment.
What if the government came in and said you had to terminate that pregnancy? How would you feel about that?
Yeah, exactly. Well, honestly, same. I would have the same thought. Now, I'm also very rebellious. I'm very much, fuck you, I won't do what you told me kind of person. So I'd be like, no, you can't. It's not your call. To be up to me and my partner, or really my partner, and hopefully me working with her and the doctor to make the best informed decision. That's the ultimate goal in my scenario. So, anyway, wow. Well, I mean, we covered a lot in an hour. I feel like we could go another 2 if we needed to. I do feel like, given the current state of things with the rise of Christian nationalism, the newest attack of IVF, the so-called abolitionist movement, which is just one of the most gross abortion pro-life movements I've ever seen. They want to literally persecute women. They want to criminalize them for getting abortions and doctors. I mean, this stuff is very serious. Like, I really feel culturally we're facing some very big threats to all the things that we just talked about. So I will keep you guys on speed dial because there's a good chance we're going to have you back on at some point to talk about whatever else is going on. I appreciate both of you making time out of very busy schedules to talk to me. Is there anything else you wanted to add to the conversation? Anything that I missed that you really feel like needs to be said before I let you both go?
Jen?
Yeah, no. I think we hit the main things that are important to me to bring up for today. Thank you.
I would just point out the common sense thing is that the thing that both people from a biblical worldview and the atheist worldview can agree upon, and that's the importance of loving our fellow human being and trying to create a world where people have a happy life. And I think that's the kind of life we need to live. And right now, some of the issues we're describing, and forgive me for saying something negative about Christian nationalism, I think that is not what our founding fathers have in mind. And I don't think that's consistent with the fundamental teaching of Jesus, where he said, that the second greatest commandment is to love your fellow human being as yourself. And I think that needs to be our guiding light.
1,000%. I say it often on this show. Christian nationalism is antichrist. Bottom line. It wants to build crosses for their neighbors, and Jesus told us to bear a cross for ours. That's the biggest difference, flat out. So, Mike, are you public? Do you have like a Twitter or a Threads or an Instagram? Can folks follow your work? Do you do stuff for lay people like me?
There's 2 things if anybody's interested in some of this. I have a series on YouTube called Back to Immortality, where I walk people through. It's actually talking about immortal cells, not the biblical view of immortality, although I do get into religion a bit. Back to Immortality, 5 episodes. And there's a book I just published, and it's a novel called Ruby Perfect. It's under a pseudonym, Zola Wold. Why would I pick a pseudonym? It's about the red heifer controversy in Israel, and it brings into in that novel some of the events occurring in the Middle East. If anybody's interested in hearing how a person with a background in stem cells and embryo ethics looks at modern Zionism, that book will tell you about that.
Oh, okay, awesome. And Jen, go ahead and plug all of your stuff. You're all over the place online these days.
I'm trying. Yeah,
I love it.
Thanks. I have a YouTube channel, Jennifer Bird, PhD, and my website actually is the best way to get to everything else. So my personal website is jennifergracebird.com. You can get to all the things. I'm primarily on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. I'm debating about TikTok these days, but yeah.
It's where all the cool kids are.
I know. Well, I'm there. It's just I keep having I keep getting shadow banned.
Yeah.
Anyway, so yeah, that's where you can find me.
Awesome. Well, friends, truly, thank you for making the time. It means the world. We'll keep in touch, and I'm sure we'll do it again soon. So thank you.
Thank you.